Marley was dead to begin with. There was never any doubt about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner, Ebenezer Scrooge. And Scrooge's name was good upon Exchange Street for anything he put his hand to. There was no doubt about it. Old Jacob Marley was as dead as a doornail. Now, mind you, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I would be inclined to think that a coffin nail was the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in simile. Therefore, I must be allowed to repeat again emphatically that old Jacob Marley was as dead as a doornail. Did Scrooge know he was dead? Well, of course he did. There was never any doubt about that. You see, Scrooge and Marley had been partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. Although even in that last part, Scrooge wasn't too dreadfully cut up by this sad affair. But all this talk about Marley's funeral brings me back to my original point, and that's that Jacob Marley was indeed dead. See, this point must be distinctly understood, or else nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. Why, if you weren't convinced that, say, Hamlet's father had died at the beginning of that play, there'd be nothing more remarkable in his wandering about the ramparts of his castle at midnight, well, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rather rashly turning out in some breezy spot after dark. Now, Scrooge never painted out Marley's name. Stayed up there years afterwards above the door. Scrooge and Marley's. That was the name of the business, Scrooge and Marley. And sometimes people who were new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes they called him Marley. Didn't matter to him one way or the other, though. He answered to both. His was a tight-fisted hand upon the grindstone, as Scrooge's was. He was a squeezing, scraping, grasping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He was as hard, as sharp as flint, but from which no steel had ever struck forth a generous flame. The cold within him nipped his pointed nose and shriveled his cheeks and sounded out in the grating of his voice. He carried his own low temperature about with him always, and with it he iced his office in the dog days of summer and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas time. No one ever walked up to him with gladsome looks and said, "Why, my dear Mr. Scrooge, how are you?" No children ever asked him what it was o'clock. No beggars ever asked him to bestow a token, and no one, man or woman, had ever asked him the directions to such and such a place. And that is exactly the way Scrooge wanted it. Oh, yeah. He wanted to ease his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Well, once upon a time, of all the good days of the year upon Christmas Eve, Scrooge sat in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather. It had been foggy all day. The clocks of the city had just struck 3, but it was already dark out. Candles blazed in the windows of nearby offices. Fog poured in at every keyhole and every chink. And outside was so thick that although the window to the courtyard outside of his office was of the narrowest on the courtyard, well, the building opposite was a mere phantom. Scrooge could hear people in that courtyard go wheezing back and forth outside his window, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet on the pavement stones to warm them. Scrooge sat with the door to his office open. See, that way he could keep an eye upon his clerk, who in his own dismal little cell beyond was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the fire of Scrooge's clerk was so very much smaller that it seemed to be only 1 coal. He didn't dare replenish it, though. You see, Scrooge kept the coal box in his office, and no sooner than the clerk would go in with the coal shovel, but the master would predict that the time had come for them to part. Wherefore, Bob Cratchit would bundle himself up in his white comforter and endeavor to warm himself at the flame of his candle, in which, not being a man of very strong imagination, he usually failed. "Merry Christmas, Uncle, God save you!" cried a cheerful voice which belonged to Scrooge's nephew, Fred, as he came bounding into the room. Now, this nephew of Scrooge's had so heated himself with rapid walking in the frost and fog that he fairly glowed. Scrooge's response was a fairly typical one. "Ah, humbug! Christmas a humbug? Surely you don't mean that, Uncle." "I do. Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Well, come to that, Uncle, what right have you to be miserable? You're rich enough." Scrooge didn't have a ready reply for this, so he simply said, "Bah," again, and followed it with yet another humbug. "Uncle Ebenezer, there's no need to be so cross."
Why shouldn't I be when I live in a world of fools such as this? Merry Christmas. Out upon your Merry Christmas, Fred. What is Christmas time to you but a time for finding yourself another year older and not 1 hour richer? Time for finding yourself with more bills to pay and no more money to pay them. It is merely a time for sitting down with your books and finding the figures for a round dozen months set dead against you. If I could work my will, every idiot that went about with Merry Christmas on his lips would be boiled in his own pudding and buried at the stake of holly through his heart. You, nephew, can keep Christmas in your own way. Please allow me to keep it in mine.
But that's just it, Uncle. You don't keep it.
Let me leave it alone, then. Much good it has ever done you. Much good it will ever do you.
Uncle Ebenezer, I will admit there are a good many things from which I have derived pleasure, but from which I have not profited. I dare say Christmas ranks first amongst all the rest.
Yet I've always thought of Christmas time, well, whenever it came around, as being a good time of year. It's a kind, caring Christian time. It's the only time in the long calendar of the months when people seem to think of those around them as fellow passengers to the grave, not as separate races of creatures all bound off on separate journeys. And although I will admit Christmas has never put one scrap of gold or silver into these pockets, I believe it has done me good. I believe it will continue to do me good, and therefore I say, God bless it. Now, Scrooge's clerk, who couldn't help overhearing this, seeing as how the door between the offices was open, involuntarily burst into applause, drawing Scrooge's attention to him. Not a sound from you, Cratchit, and you will keep your Christmas by losing your situation.
Uncle Ebenezer, come and dine with me and Meg tomorrow afternoon.
I think rather not.
But why not?
Why did you get married?
That's an easy one, Uncle. I got married because I fell in love, and... Uncle Ebenezer, you can't use that as your reason for not coming to see me. You never came to see me before that happened, so you cannot use it now.
I am a very busy man, Fred. Good afternoon.
Oh, Uncle, does my heart pain to find you so resolute. But I have done trial and homage to Christmas, and I refuse to lose my Christmas humor. So since you are so infernally busy, I will simply bid you good day, good afternoon. And a Merry Christmas, Uncle Ebenezer. Good afternoon, Fred. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon, Fred. Now, Scrooge's nephew left without an angry word, and on the way out bestowed the greetings of the season upon Scrooge's clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge was because he returned them cordially. As he was letting Scrooge's nephew out, however, he let another fellow in, a portly gentleman, pleasant enough in appearance, and he now stood in Scrooge's office with his hat in his hands.
Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge? Or might you be Mr. Marley?
My partner, Jacob Marley, died 7 years ago. 7 years ago this very night.
Oh, I have no doubt his liberality is well represented in the surviving partner. Now then, Mr. Scrooge, sir. At this festive season of the year, sir, it's more than usually desirable that we should make some provision for the poor and destitute. They suffer greatly at this time of year, you know. There are thousands without the common comforts, hundreds of thousands without the common necessaries.
Are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, they are still in operation?
Well, very busy, sir, I'm sorry to say.
Oh. From what you had said at first, I thought something had occurred to stop them in their useful course.
Well, bearing in mind, Mr. Scrooge, sir, that these hardly provide Christian cheer of mind and body to the multitudes, a few of us are endeavoring to create a fund whereby we might be able to provide the poor with meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, above all other festive seasons of the year, because it is that, well, festive season of the year in which want is most keenly felt and abundance rejoices. And now then, how much shall I put you down for?
Nothing.
You wish to remain anonymous, eh, what?
I wish to be left alone. You ask me what I want, sir, and that is my answer. I do not make merry myself at Christmas time, and I cannot afford to make idle people merry. I hope to support those establishments that I have already mentioned. They cost us quite enough. Those who are badly off must go there.
Mr. Scrooge, sir, many cannot. Many more would rather die first.
Well, if they be like to die, let them get on with it. They can reduce the surplus population. Good afternoon.
Seeing quite clearly that it was useless to pursue his point, the portly gentleman left. Outside, the fog and darkness had thickened so that people ran about with flaring torches, offering their services to go before horses with carriages and conduct them on their way. The cold had become intense, but the light from shop windows where holly, sprigs, and berries crackled in the lamp heat, but made even pale faces ruddy as they passed by. The poulterers' and grocers' stores had become a glorious pageant, a sort of a splendid joke where it became next to impossible to believe that such mundane principles as bargains and sales had ever held forth. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as the Lord Mayor should, and even the little tailor, whom the Lord Mayor had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday. He'd been drunk out on the streets. Even he was busy in his little garret apartment, stirring up the next day's pudding, while his lean wife and baby sallied forth into the nose-biting cold to fetch the beef. Now, the owner of one such young nose knelt down before Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the very first sounds of "God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized up a ruler, such energy of action that the young singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the more congenial fog and frost. At length, the hour came for shutting up the counting-house, and Scrooge, in a rather ill humor, dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted this fact to his expectant clerk, who immediately snuffed his candle, closed his book, and put on his scarf.
I suppose you will want all day tomorrow.
Well, yes, sir. Yeah, if it's quite convenient, sir, yes.
It is not convenient, and it is not fair. If I were to dock your pay half a crown, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. Yet you do not think me ill-used to pay you a full day's wages for no work.
It's only once a year, sir.
Poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Very well. If you must have the entire day, take it. But be here all the sooner the next morning.
Bob Cratchit agreed that he would. Ebenezer Scrooge left with a growl, and Bob Cratchit, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling down in front of him, ran home to Camden Town as fast as he could pelt to play at blind man's bluff with his children. Ebenezer Scrooge took his usual melancholy supper in his usual melancholy diner, and having read all the newspapers and beguiling the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. Now, he stayed in apartments which had once belonged to a 7 years deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms and a lowering pile of building. No one else lived there, of course. Scrooge rented out all the rest of the rooms as offices. Now, Scrooge had seen the knocker on this house, night and morning, his entire residence in the place. And it should be borne in mind that there was nothing at all particular about that house, let alone the knocker on its front door, except that both were exceedingly large and, well, if we're going to be completely honest, rather ugly. You should also keep in mind the fact that Scrooge had not given a single thought to a 7 years deceased partner since his last mention of him that afternoon. So I would like anyone here to explain to me, if you could, how it came to be that Scrooge, upon stepping up to the door and slipping his key into the lock, glanced upon the knocker and saw, without it undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. It was Jacob Marley's face. It wasn't in some impenetrable shadow like other objects in the yard. It had its own dull light about it. It looked neither angry nor ferocious, but looked as Marley had looked in life, down to his ghostly spectacles pushed up upon his ghostly forehead. His hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and its eyes, though they were open, they were completely motionless. This, coupled with its livid color, made it horrible to see. Yet its horror seemed to be quite beyond its control and not a part of its expression. As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it became a knocker again. To say that Scrooge was not put off by this would be untrue, but he put his hand back upon the key he had relinquished, turned it solidly, opened the door, and walked into the hallway. He did pause with a moment's hesitation before closing the door, and he did glance cautiously behind the door first, in case he expected to see Marley's tail end sticking out on the other side, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the nuts and bolts that held the knocker on, so Scrooge shut that door with a bang. That sound resounded throughout that house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below had a separate peal of echoes all its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes, so he locked the door, crossed the hallway, lit a candle, and started up the staircase. Now, I know you've all been in some grand home in England with a staircase large enough to drive a coach and six right up it. Well, I mean to tell you, you could have taken a hearse up this staircase, sideways, with the horses. It was big enough for that. And that might be why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on up before him in the gloom. He followed after it, not caring a fig about that, and also caring very little that his candle did almost nothing to dispel the darkness. Scrooge rather liked darkness. It was free. When he got to the top of the stairs, he went down the hallway to the door to his apartments, unlocked the door, and let himself in. Before closing this door, however, he decided to look around just to make sure that everything was as it should be there. There were 3 rooms, a sitting room, a changing room, and a sleeping room. There was no one behind his sofa, and no one under his table. No one was hiding under the bed or behind the dresser or in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a rather suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite certain that he was alone, he went back to the door and locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, actually, which wasn't his usual practice, but thus secured against surprise, he took off his greatcoat and his cravat, put on his dressing gown, nightcap, and slippers, and sat down by the fire. If you could call it a fire. It was nothing on such a bitterly cold night. Scrooge was obliged to sit very close to it and brood over it before he could extract the slightest sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was a large old one. It was paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles. They were all designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cain's and Abel's and Pharaoh's daughters, apostles putting out to sea, hundreds of images to distract Scrooge's thoughts. Jacob Marley's face kept swimming up like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowing the whole. If every one of those smooth tiles had been a blank and had within itself some magic to fashion on its surface some image from Scrooge's disjointed thoughts, Marley's head would have been bang in the center of every one of them. At length, he sat back in his chair to relax, and his glance happened upon a bell. This was a disused bell that hung up in a corner of the room and connected, for some reason now long forgotten, with another room at the very top of the house. It was with a growing sense of apprehension that as Scrooge stared at this bell, it began to swing. It swung so slowly in the outset that it made no sound at all, but then suddenly it was ringing out loudly, as were all the rest of the bells in the house. This might have gone on for a minute or 5 minutes, but it seemed like hours, and then suddenly they all stopped, just as they'd begun together. Followed by a low clanking noise deep down below. It sounded as if someone were dragging chains across the cask in the white merchant's cellar. It was only then that Scrooge remembered having heard that the ghosts that were said to describe houses were usually described as dragging chains, but suddenly the cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and he could hear the noise much louder on the floor beneath him. Then it was coming up the staircase and down the hallway directly towards his door. Now, Ebenezer Scrooge was not a man who was easily frightened, but his very color changed when, without a pause, the spirit walked right through the door and into his room. It was Jacob Marley's ghost. Marley, in his usual waistcoat and breeches and boots, the tassels on the latter were bristling out, just like his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. The chains that he drew were very long. They wound about his body like a snake, and were made, for Scrooge was able to observe them closely, of cash boxes and keys and heavy ledgers and purses, all wrought in steel. But the spirit's body was transparent. Looking at it, Scrooge found he could look right through it, right through the waistcoat to the 2 buttons on the greatcoat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no guts, but he never believed it until then. No, nor did he believe it even then. For though he could see that spirit standing right before him, Feel the chilling influence of his death-cold eyes. Mark the very texture of the scarf that was bound about its head and chin. He still remained doubtful.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much.
Who are you?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Now, there was no doubt about it. It was Marley's voice, but Scrooge refused to believe it.
Can you sit down in a chair?
Scrooge asked this question because he didn't know if a spirit so incredibly transparent would find itself in a position to actually be able to take a seat. And in the event that he couldn't, it might necessitate an embarrassing explanation, but the spirit sat down opposite the fire from him as if he were quite used to it. You do not believe in me?
No.
What evidence do you need of my existence beyond that of your senses?
I have no idea.
Why do you doubt your senses?
No, because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of the grave about you, whatever you are. You see this toothpick? I need but to swallow this, and I can be plagued for the rest of my days by a legion of goblins, all of them of my own creation. You, sir, are a humbug. Humbug!
Now, hearing this, the spirit shook his chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to the arms of his chair to keep from falling into a swoon. How much greater was his terror, though, when the spirit began to unwind the scarf that was bound about its head and chin and allowed its jaw to fall down upon its breast. Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
Oh, I do! I must. Oh, heavens. Why do spirits walk the earth? Why do they visit me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him walk abroad and travel far and wide. But if the spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so, off to death.
But you're fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chains I forged in life. I made them link by link and yard by yard. Of my own free will I pinned them on, and of my own free will I wore them. Is their pattern strange to you, Ebenezer? Or would you know the weight and length, the strong coil you bear yourself? 'Twas full as long and heavy as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You've labored much on yours since. 'Tis a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced around the floor, half expecting to see himself surrounded by 50 or 60 fathoms of heavy iron links, but he could see nothing.
Oh, Jacob, speak comfort to me.
Comfort, Ebenezer? I've none to give. That comes from other regions, delivered by other kinds of ministers to other kinds of men. In life, my spirit never left our counting house. Weary journeys lie before me now.
Oh, but you were always such a good man of business, Jacob.
Business? Mankind was my business. Humanity, charity, benevolence were all my business. The trappings of our trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Why did I walk amongst our fellow man with my eyes cast down, never once raising them to that blessed star that led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light might have conducted me? List, Ebenezer, list. You are about to be condemned to fall into my foul fate. But you still have a hope